Hello, everyone. This is Yan Zheng from Carnegie Institution for Science. Today, I'm going to talk about using a finite element model to understand the possible degassing and the sealing process during volcanic unrest of Augustine volcano. Before most of the volcanic eruption, restless behavior are usually observed, such as degassing, surface deformation, and earthquakes. It is important to use quantitative tools to understand the magma dynamics and its response of surrounding rocks. Therefore, we can forecast when a magma system is approaching the critical condition for eruption. Today, I'm going to show you a case study from Augustine volcano. The Augustine volcano is located in Cook Inlet, Alaska. It has erupted several times during the past century. Each time the eruption happened, produced anesthetic to the acidic materials. The most recent eruption happened in 2006. After a series of phreatic eruption, a VI3 explosive eruption began in January 11, 2006. Before the eruption, there are multiple precursor signals. So let's take a look at starting at September 2005, 4 months before the eruption, an observable surface uplift has been reviewed by continuous GPS data. The study by Savelli and others show that there is a shallow pressure source followed by dike ascending can explain the GPS signal. For seismicity, Augustine has a pretty high background seismicity. And in May 2005, the number of volcano-tectonic earthquakes start to increase gradually. Remarkably, most of the VTs occur above the sea level within the edifice, and the deeper VT swarm did not occur until right before eruption. In addition to surface deformation and seismicity, a thermometer in one of the seismometer provides us air temperature close to the summit. You can see here. Although it is not a direct measurement of the fumarole temperature, the forward-looking infrared radiometer shows a maximum temperature of that fumarole about 200 degrees C at December 2005, which can be used as a reference. So the data indicate there is a gradually increasing fumarole's temperature, at least a year before eruption. Combining geodetic, seismic, and petrologic data, many previous study has already proposed some model to explain the unrest. A new magma, a new basalt may inject and mix with a long existing high silica crystal mush. Then the degassing of this basalt generates volatiles that pressurize this shallow conduit system. And later the overpressure exceeding the host rock strength and triggering the cracking of the rock, clear the way to the erupt. If we take the temperature evolution into account, we may find a heat flux is required well before the geodetic unrest you can see here. It is reasonable to think the gas may seep and bring heat to the surface before pressurizing the shallow storage. So we want to ask, first, how much gas is required to produce this temperature change? And the second, how can the pressure build up during the geodetic unrest? And finally, what is the role of the material property, especially the permeability? Conceptually, we can use an instant pot model as an analog. Assume here is an instant pot, which is filled with mushy soup. Then bubbles can generate it. If bubble is allowed to escape from the pressure valve, we can measure the heat carried by those heat flux. But if we close the valve, which is the sealing process in the nature, a large overpressure can be built, create deformation, and finally breaking the system. So by borrowing this idea, we want to use numerical simulations to understand how sealing process control the heat transfer, surface deformation, and VT earthquakes during the unrest. Here, we use a 2D axisymmetric model to simulate the upper part of the volcanic system. The gas flux here is treated as a boundary condition. We want to know how temperature and ground deformation is affected by this gas flux through a porous conduit to the surface. And what if the permeability is changing? In this study, we assume the gas is steam since Augustine volcano is a water-rich system. Vapor extrusion has been observed and modeled by different means. So now let's look at the best fit model that can reproduce both surface deformation and temperature. The scattered plots are data, GPS and temperature. The solid lines are model results. This is surface deformation, temperature, and this is mass flux, and this is the permeability of the upper part of this conduit. You can see at the beginning, the temperature is controlled by the heat conduction of a long existing reservoir. The temperature is according to the petrological study, and the deformation is 0. Then the temperature gradually increased if the steam flux is 5 kilograms per second or 400 tons per day. So this rate is comparable to the volcano La Sauville in 2012. The permeability of the conduit is about 10 to the negative 10 meters square. But you can see in the same time, there's no surface deformation because the gas can escape from the system efficiently. Okay, now around September 2005, the permeability of the upper part of the conduit reduced to about 10 to the negative 15 meters square. Although an increment of the gas flux is needed to create the observable surface deformation, you can see the gas flux is increased from 5 kilograms per second to about 90 kilograms per second, which is 8,000 tons per day. But even with this high gas flux, the temperature stopped increase. That is due to the sealing, since now the gas is no longer efficiently escaped from the system. In this best fit model, we need both mass flux increment and the sealing. So I want to ask, what if some condition is missing? So we did a series of tests. In the first test, we assume there is no mass flux increment or sealing. The figure shown here is the deformation in the left, temperature in the right, under different constant mass flux from 5 kilograms to 90 kilograms per second. However, how high the mass flux is, no surface deformation is found. So this scenario didn't work. Okay, in this second test, the gas flux is initially 5 kilograms per second and then increased to a higher value. Very similar to the previous test, a high mass flux creates a dramatic temperature increment, but has little effect on surface deformation here if there's no sealing process. So this scenario is rejected as well. In the third test, we consider the sealing, but with a constant mass flux. With high mass flux, the observed displacement can be produced. You can see from those plots. However, the high constant mass flux also create a very high temperature at the very beginning. So that make this case didn't work as well. When we consider both sealing and increasing mass flux, we can reproduce observation by certain combination of the permeability and the mass flux, and other combination didn't work. As a reference, the permeability of the porous andesite is in order of 10 to the negative 12 meters square, and granite is about 10 to the negative 20 meters square. Therefore, it's reasonable that our fractured conduit before sealing is more permeable than this porous andesite. And a sealed conduit is between this andesite to the intact granite. So now let's see if this model can explain seismicity. In the left, we should model the pore pressure versus depth. Each colored line is a snapshot. The right plot is a cross-section shows earthquake distribution. Before sealing, pore pressure is very low. And after sealing, you can see the pore pressure increased significantly by about 2.5 megapascal. Although the pore pressure increases over the entire unsealed conduit, there is no deep seismicity triggered by the pore pressure increment. So why? Okay, let's see. Our model seems to missing an important effect, that is initial stress, especially the load of the edifice. So we add gravity to the model, and we calculate the Coulomb stress as an indicator for shear fracture. The figure shown here, you can see with the gravity loading, the volcano edifice is easier to fail than the host rock below it, since the Mohr circle of the upper part is closer and cut this failure envelope. Now we plot the Coulomb stress of the conduit at different depths. And when there is no pore pressure, the Coulomb stress is already higher within the edifice than below the edifice. And when adding a pore pressure, the Coulomb stress can increase by 1 megapascal. Although 1 megapascal seems small, it may play an important role if the rock is about to fail. Just shown here. When compared to distribution of the VT earthquake, we can see higher Coulomb stress is consistent with higher VT earthquake energy releasing. So to summarize, years before the eruption, a steam flux brought heat from deep to the surface, causing a gradually increasing surface temperature. After September 2005, mass flux of steam increased. Meanwhile, the permeability of the upper part of the conduit dropped a lot, pressurizing the lower conduit that can create the surface deformation. And increasing pore pressure helps triggers more earthquake, but in a shallow level due to the initial stress. So that's it. Looking forward to have more discussion, and thank you for your attention.